Hey everybody, welcome to Taco Tuesday. Let me all know if you can hear me or not. I'm not hearing myself the way I usually am, so I want to make sure you guys can all hear me. Had a few technical difficulties there, so thanks for waiting. We're coming here a few minutes late, and we'll get started in a minute. If someone can just confirm in the chat that you can hear me, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. In the meantime, loud and clear, thank you. Thanks, Rabbinic Pastor. Nice to see you, buddy. Nice to see you in here. You're a faithful follower. Hey, thanks to everybody who is in the chat and who was queued up and has been here every Tuesday since the start. Always very grateful for those of you who are watching and subscribing, following, sharing, all that good stuff. Couldn't do it without you, so thank you so much. All right, I'm going to get right into it. And this just, oh, you know what, guys? I think I figured it out. I've done this before. There we go. There we go. You know? All right, as you can see from the background, I'm not in my home space, and so I had a lot of technical glitches this morning for some reason, but we are ready to go. So last week we had a pretty deep dive, so I thought, let's do something fun. Let's do something more casual this week. And I had sort of hinted around last week that there's some kind of spooky, fun geographic and historical lore pertaining to the city or the region of Galilee. And so I thought, you know what, that'll be a good thing. Let's do that this week. So let's just get started. All right. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint. So guys, I'm not always going to do a PowerPoint. I know I did one last week and I know I did one this week, but it's more just because there's a lot of maps and pictures and scripture references. And so rather than everybody fumbling to, ask in the chat, what did you just say or all that, I just thought it'd be easier to do it this way. So we're going to be talking about Galilee today, specifically Tiberias, which in the first century was the capital of Galilee. So on this map, the yellow region up in the very north, that's Galilee. And you'll see the little blue body of water right there to the right of it. And that is the Sea of Galilee. We're going to be talking about that a lot today. So at the northern region of the Sea of Galilee, that's up in Capernaum. And obviously a lot of New Testament references to the city of Capernaum. So when Jesus is in Capernaum, he is in the north of Galilee and at the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, where we're going to be focusing our talk today is the southern region, but actually it's technically the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Sea of Galilee, that's what that it would have been in Hebrew. That's what the locals would have called it, Sea of Galilee. But because Tiberias was ruled by a consort that was assigned by Rome, the Roman name of the western shore of the Sea of Galilee was the Sea of Tiberias, because it was the shore right there by the region or the city of Tiberias, which we're going to learn a lot about today. There's just some amazing history with that. So, all right, so Galilee was located in northern Israel. The capital city was Tiberias, and it was named by Herod after the Roman Emperor Tiberius. And we talked about this last week. We're talking now about Herod Antipas, not Herod the Great. Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great. So to avoid confusion from this point forward, I will just refer to him as Antipas. So Antipas is the ruler of Tiberius. He's not the king. He was appointed by Rome to rule Tiberias and Perea. All right, so looking at my notes here, it was founded around 18 to 20 AD. It was built by Antipas. It's on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, referred to as the Sea of Tiberias in Roman. All right, so tetrarch, that was the word I was stretching for, guys, before. Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee. He was appointed by the emperor of Rome, to rule these two regions. Okay, so I kind of already went through all this. He went through this. Okay, here's some really interesting things. Herod Antipas, he was not well liked by the Jews. He was not trusted. he was seen kind of as a traitor because he was sort of a butt kisser. He names Tiberius after a Roman emperor, and keep in mind the oppression that Rome had over Israel and over the Jewish people. And so he was kind of seen as someone who was kissing Rome's butt and acting in collusion with them and going along with all of the things that they wanted for this region. And in addition to that, there's a couple other things we need to know. Herod Antipas was a descendant of Abraham and Isaac, but he was not a descendant of Jacob. He was an Edomite. He was a descendant of Esau. So he was from the Abrahamic lineage, but he was not the chosen line. And so obviously the Jews also saw him as not necessarily being in their court politically. So 2 strikes against Antipas thus far, but there's actually a 3rd strike against Antipas as well. And that is that Tiberias was built over the ruins of an ancient cemetery. And we're going to go into why that was a problem with devout Jews in a moment. So what's interesting here about Galilee is that this is where Jesus was born. Nazareth, you can see, is there in the southwest corner. And so why is the Messiah coming into being born in and starting his ministry in a region that is primarily Gentiles and non-devout Jews? If he's coming as the Jewish Messiah, why is he already, before the mystery of the gospel is revealed later after the book of Acts and in the book of Ephesians and later after the resurrection, why is the Jewish Messiah showing up in a region populated by non-devout Jews, Edomites, and foreigners? Okay. This is just an aerial shot of Sea of Galilee because I just thought it was interesting, and this will give you a non-map version. So this is kind of how big it is, and you can kind of see what the shoreline looks like. All right, so as I mentioned, Tiberias, which is the capital of the Galilee, was a recycled graveyard. We know this because Jewish historian Flavius Josephus talks about it, and he tells us that Antipas built Tiberias on a site that was built over abandoned tombs. In Jewish law, graves transmit ritual impurity. You can find that in Numbers 19. And living on top of them was a serious problem for a devout Jew because you would be, in essence, in a perpetual state of ritual impurity if you were living in that region. So because of this, most devout Jews refused to live there, despite the perks of living there tax-free. So Antipas had all of these sort of bribes and incentives, and sometimes by force, ways to Tiberias, because turns out nobody really wanted to live there. So he compelled them by saying, if you live here, you don't have to pay taxes. And there were other things like that. But primarily the early settlers of Tiberias, they were the poor, they were freed slaves, foreigners, and basically folks who did not really care about the ritual purity laws. So the devout and the Orthodox were definitely not pitching their tent in Tiberias in the first century. All right, Tiberias was also politically compromised. So because Herod placated to Rome and he paid homage to all the emperors and he put his own political ambition above the Jewish ritual purity laws, people didn't want to live there. They didn't trust him. They did not see him as someone who was in their court. So because of all this, Antipas alienated himself from the devout Jews. And this made Tiberias culturally suspect. And this cemented Tiberias as an unclean or a suspect city in the minds of devout Jews. So the city's foundation, being built over tombs, gave way to folklore, rumors, and fear surrounding the dead, ghosts, apparitions, and divine reappearances. So last week, when we were talking about the differences between resurrection, divine appearances, reincarnation, and pre-existence of the soul, these are 4 very, very different things, but they're often conflated. We talked a little bit about divine reappearances and how in the first century, in the Jewish mind, they wouldn't have defined ghosts or zombies or the dead the same way we would define a reincarnated soul or someone who had resurrected from the dead. We went into examples of Martha, and we know that the Jewish understanding of a resurrection was one day a Messiah is going to come, and we collectively as a people will all be resurrected on the last day together. They didn't believe that resurrection was an individual premature event. It was a one-time corporate event in the future. And so they didn't, as we went into great detail last week using proof text after proof text after proof text, the more Jesus talked about resurrection, the more perplexed and confused the people became. It didn't give more clarity to the situation because they couldn't see outside of their compartmentalized definitions and their cultural understanding of resurrection being a one-time corporate act at the end of the age. And so along with this, we talked about divine reappearances. And so it's not the same thing as a ghost, but there was a culture-wide belief system in the first century among Jews that if a righteous man or a prophet was unjustly killed, if they were misrepresented, if they were put to death, if they were martyred, if they were a righteous man, they believed that there was divine reappearances where these prophets and righteous men would come back from the dead. They would be familiar, they would look the way that they looked on earth, but they were more of an apparition. And it was believed that this was some sort of a vengeance or a vindication where these righteous people would come back to, kind of shake their fist and say, I told you so. So seeing an apparition, whether it was really happening, one could argue perhaps Saul with the witch at Endor. One could argue the Transfiguration, where there was a one-time appearance of Moses and Elijah. One could also argue that perhaps this was smoke and mirrors. Maybe this is something that the enemy used to gain control and power through fear. And perhaps it was just familiars or familiar spirits reappearing for whatever reason. So, but just bear in mind that divine reappearances is theologically, contextually, and culturally something a little bit different than a ghost. It would not have been the way we think of ghost stories and the way a first century Semitic mind thinks of them are different. Everything in the ancient Semitic mind was through covenant and theological frameworks, not through New Age or occult frameworks. All right, so there were also religious concerns pertaining to Tiberias. So in Second Temple Judaism, any contact with graves, like we said, would have been viewed as ritual impurity. And living over the graves would have meant continuous defilement. And so they would have been, according to the Torah, constantly having to do the ritual washings and cleansing. They would never be able to get on top of it. And when you are ritually impure, that means you can't go to the temple, you can't appear in public, you're at home doing your 3 days of being sequestered, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were constantly in contact with graves, you would have to basically become a hermit. You would not be able, according to the Torah, to be out amongst the public or even attending the feasts or the festivals or the temple or the synagogue on the Sabbath. So for a devout Jew, this would not be a good deal, even if it meant not having to pay their taxes. So the devout Jews stayed away from Tiberias in the first century. All right. Tombs were associated with death and contamination. These were not neutral grounds. All right. I think that's all pretty obvious. So let's take a little nerdy etymological break here. This is the kind of stuff I love. Galilee, what does it mean? All right, we're really good when we're reading our Bibles that when we come across something that doesn't make sense to us or something that seems a little odd. What is it? Dr. Michael Heiser always said, if something doesn't make sense, it's important. Or if something's strange, if something's weird, it's important. Is that what it is? Someone can put in the chat the exact quote. It's a good one. So we're pretty good about looking up things if we, are curious about it. But I will tell you that if we take time when we're reading, anytime a city or a location or a geographical area is mentioned, if you do a little bit of research on that, some really interesting, even some spine-chilling stuff can come up. So we're going to take a little look at Galilee here. And I'm just going to pause for a second. Dr. Michael Lake once said, I don't know if this originated with him. I'm sure he might have gotten it from someone else, but he once said that the problem with our understanding of the scriptures isn't bad translations. It's that we take our translations and we fail to take into account the culture, the history, the language, the geography of the original text. Culture, context, history, language, geography. There's 5 of them. And the first time I heard that made total sense to me, but I thought geography, like who cares? Geography, who cares, right? But I'm seeing now, especially with the study that we're doing now, that sometimes geography can overturn some really, really, really fascinating rocks. So Galilee comes from the Hebrew word Galil, and its basic meaning is a circle or a ring. And the official narrative, if you go online, it will say, well, Galilee must have been a circular region of land, which doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're looking at the map. And we're going to figure out later what that circle or that ring might be. So stay tuned. So Galilee does not originally mean, it's not a mystical title. It's literally a geographical term. And here's the official narrative. It's referring to a circular tract of land or a defined territorial region. Maybe, but I think there's a better explanation than that if you dig a little deeper. We'll go into that in a sec. So the fuller biblical expression of Galil HaGoyim. Now, people that know, you're going to recognize that phrase Goyim. So, we know that Goyim means the nations or the Gentiles, the outsiders. And so Galilee literally means the district or region of the nations or the Gentiles. So this is primarily foreigners. So again, really interesting that if Jesus is King of the Jews, that he is born in and starts his ministry in a region of the Gentiles, not the Jews. Might be a little foreshadowing there of the mystery of the gospel. So that's actually very important theologically. The Messiah was expected to arise from Jerusalem, the holy city, or of Judah, the royal tribe. Instead, Jesus grows up in Nazareth of Galilee, basically the religiously suspect borderlands. And that's why Nathanael might have said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Here we see a little bit of a racial slur. Why would the Messiah, why would the King of the Jews be born in this filthy Rome/Edomite ruled graveyard where ritually impure people live? What the Messiah would not be caught dead in such a ritually impure place. And so this was one of the reasons why right off the bat, people were suspect of Jesus and who he said he was. So when Matthew quotes Isaiah, a great light has dawned in Galilee of the Gentiles. He is saying God deliberately began his ministry, not in the religious center, but in the outskirts. Okay, so let's talk about some of the superstitions. These are common beliefs in the first century. Number 1, spirits of the dead could appear. And we already talked about this. This is the divine reappearances. Okay. The dead were thought to retain identity, meaning if you saw one of these divine spirits of the dead, you would readily recognize them. You know, if grandma came back, grandma looks like grandma. It's not like they're not coming back in the form of a shadow man or a demon with red glowing eyes or as a alien gray. They're coming back looking. They're not corporeal anymore. They're not flesh and bone, but they retain their identity. Again, different from resurrection, because when Jesus came back, he didn't come back as a divine reappearance or an apparition. He came back in a full corporeal body, which is why he ate the fish. And he the reason why he was doing that is he was proving to the disciples, I'm not a divine reappearance. I'm not a righteous man who died unjustly coming back to shake my fist. I actually have a resurrected body. And those are the questions. That's why Thomas doubted, because this idea of a bodily resurrection did not fit their cultural understanding of something that would come back from the dead. All right, so here's some other superstitions. Graves, ruins, and the wilderness, they were considered spirit prone. We know the desert and the dry places are where the demons that are cast out go. They go to the waterless places. So graves and ruins, keep that on the back burner. That's going to come up later. And wilderness were these liminal spaces, these thresholds that were thin, and they believed that the spirits and the celestials could interact with them more easily, which is why a lot of people went into the wilderness and up on mountaintops and to Luz to lay their head on Jupiter Lapis stones to astral project like Jacob did. This is why people went out on these quests, is because they were looking for spiritual guidance. Okay, so sudden appearances were often interpreted as apparitions. We've already talked about that. Okay, now we're going to go into some of the passages where the Sea of Galilee, or even specifically the Sea of Tiberias, is named as the location of the event. And so just know that in folklore, divine reappearances and apparitions could also be the Raphaim or the shades. That storms and waters were associated in the ancient mind as chaos, and that sunken cities were in the Semitic mind associated with judgment. So sunken cities, you've got the Noah flood narrative, destroyed the ruins. We talked about ruins, Sodom and Gomorrah. By the 1st century, people understood that if there was a city that was no more, or that it was wiped out, or that it was ruins, whether it was Jericho, whether it was Sodom and Gomorrah, that wasn't just a tornado or a weather anomaly, but that was actually divine judgment. That is the way the 1st century Semitic mind would have interpreted a ruined or destroyed city, or a city sunken or submerged in water. Okay, so let's go through 3 of these passages in particular that are set at the western shore on the Sea of Tiberias. So Matthew 14, 25 through 27. Now when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." Okay, this was the Sea of Tiberias. This wasn't up in the north by Capernaum. They were on the sea. They were on the shore, and they probably could look over their shoulder and see Tiberias, this suspect city built over the tombs. So that already kind of gives it a creepy allure. All right, the disciples are alone. Jesus is not with them. It's dark. The 4th watch of the night is 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so we're thinking it's probably at best dusk, but still dark. The sun has not begun to rise yet. So they're dark. It's dark. They're in the middle of the sea. It specifically says they're in the middle of the sea. So it's not like they can't just backpedal and quickly get back to shore. They're stuck there until this storm passes. And it is storm tossed. It says that the sea is being tossed by the waves. All right, so this event is happening right there on the shores of Tiberias. There's a storm. So now you have chaos doctrine coming into it. All of the stuff that ancient Semitic people believed about the sea, and going all the way back to Genesis, where the creation story is almost metaphorically described as God warring with the waters, pushing them back, and chaos. And we're going to go a little bit into the tohu bohu of the Hebrew there. So there's some really even deeper analogies to sea creatures and chaos in that phrase. So it's dark. And what's so crazy about this, guys, is they're in the middle of the sea. It's dark. There's a storm. They're looking at this creepy town. And there's other things going on too that we'll talk about in a few. But this event, this is what blows my mind. This event happened after Jesus calmed the storm. So they already know that Jesus just said, peace be still, and the storm calmed. And so my guess is the reason why they didn't learn anything the first time and they're still scared, even though they're in the same exact situation they were before, is they must have thought that the power or the authority to calm that sea or to calm their own fears lied in Jesus and Jesus alone. And since Jesus wasn't with them, they're in big trouble. So this explains why when they did see Jesus, they assumed it was a ghost, because they already are dealing with darkness, which is associated with evil. They're dealing with a storm on the sea, which is waters, which is associated with chaos. And they're here by this city built over the tombs, which is ritual impurity and Gentiles. And then they see this ghost. And so because of their culture and the way that they defined and understood these things, the framework that they had for this sort of a situation would have been that this is some sort of divine retribution or chaos. All right, so it was the perfect storm. They were terrified and said it's a ghost. So the reaction makes sense because, like I said, we've already gone through this. It's at night. They're in the middle of the storm. They're on a body of water. And culturally, they believed and feared apparitions. And so apart from the darkness and the storm, was there anything else creating a darker fear that led them to believe that Jesus was an apparition? We're going to go into that in a minute because there was. All right. This is what is really cool. When they do find out that it's Jesus, Jesus doesn't say, I'm not a ghost. You guys are idiots. Like, your culture is all folklore and mythology. I can't believe how dumb you guys are. Haven't you learned anything? He doesn't shame them. He doesn't rebuke them. And he doesn't even say, I'm not a ghost. He doesn't tell them that they're imagining things or that they're schizophrenic or that they're delusional or that they need psychotropic medication. He doesn't say there's no such thing as Raphaim or shades or ghosts. What he says is, it is I. And so this shifts that moment from fear of spirits, darkness, chaos, waters, judgment, ritual impurity, graves, nations, and it shifts it to recognition of a divine appearance. And so, again, just like when he calmed the waves and they said, who is this who can control the wind and the waves? Jesus is now also giving a larger framework to darkness, chaos, death, and tombs and apparitions. Not saying that none of it exists or that it's all folklore, but that he is reframing it. So let's go to Mark chapter 4. Jesus calms the storm. And in the timeline, this event, which also happened on the Sea of Galilee in the Tiberias region, this event of him calming the storm, as I said earlier, happened before the event where they saw him and thought he was a ghost. So I'm just going to read a little snippet of verse 1 and verse 35. And again, he began to teach by the sea. And on the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us cross over to the other side. Okay. So here's the thing with trying to determine whether or not the storm that Jesus calmed was the Sea of Tiberias specifically. None of the Gospels say we were in the Sea of Tiberias. They all just say the sea. And you have to do a little bit of study and piecing the Gospels together and looking at the timeline of where they were that day to figure out that not only are they on the Sea of Galilee, but they actually are at the Sea of Tiberias. And you know this because they're preaching in Capernaum. And then on that same day, Jesus says, let's cross over to the other side, which would have been the western shore of Tiberias. And another reason we know is if you go back to the map that I showed at the very beginning of this PowerPoint, you'll notice that the only real significant bodies of water in Israel is in the north, you have the Sea of Galilee. In the south, you have the Dead Sea, and the two bodies of water are connected by the Jordan River. And so we know it's not the Dead Sea because the Dead Sea is by Jerusalem, and Jesus at this point in his ministry has not yet appeared in Jerusalem. He is still doing ministry in Galilee and in the north. And so the Dead Sea in antiquity and even today, it's not prone to dangerous squalls and storms. It's got dense, salty water. Fishermen would not have been docking boats and trying to catch fish in the Dead Sea. So when you see the sea mentioned here, it is something that the ancients would have known. It would not have needed to be explained to them because they would have known the geography, and they would have known that fishermen fish in the Sea of Galilee. And they would have known that people don't fish in the Dead Sea, and they would have known from a weather perspective that if there's squalls and storms, it's not the Dead Sea, it is the Sea of Galilee. All right, this is really fascinating. So far we have Jesus appearing as an apparition on the Sea of Tiberias, and we have a storm that he calms with a word. So Jesus, with the power of his voice, conquers chaos, the waters. Now, there's one other reference to the Sea of Tiberias that's really interesting. So we know that Jesus was born in Galilee. He started his ministry in Galilee. And now we have him appearing after the resurrection. So this is from John 21, and this is just snippets of verse 1, 12, and 14. After these things, Jesus followed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So Jesus is appearing after his resurrection. And one of the three places he chooses is the shore, the western shore of the Sea of Tiberias. So he is now, again, in this ritually impure land of the Gentiles, region of the nations. He's on the shore of Tiberias, which means the disciples on the water that he's talking to are in the Sea of Tiberias. So this culturally would have been interpreted as a divine reappearance because they still quite hadn't figured out that whole resurrection thing yet, right? And so at this point, they probably, again, would have just thought Jesus was an apparition. And I think the text doesn't directly say it, but the fact that he eats fish in front of them is, again, he's trying to get it through their cultural heads. I'm not an apparition. I'm corporeal. I'm able to eat and digest food. Okay, fun fact. Jesus appears in Galilee after the resurrection. The word Galilee is etymologically related to the word galal, which means to roll away as a stone. And so I just love the poetic symmetry there, that Jesus raises from the dead, the stone is rolled away, and then he appears in Galilee as a resurrected Messiah to the city whose very name means to roll away a stone. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the more mythological, cultural aspects of Galilee that have been lost to time. Sea of Galilee, a redeemed Atlantis. Are there any theological or spiritual parallels between the Sea of Galilee and the sunken city of Atlantis? Okay. All right. The geological backdrop of the Sea of Galilee. This matters more than we think. Okay, here's some fun facts about the Sea of Galilee. It sits on the Syro-African Rift, which is a major fault line. This region has frequent earthquakes, both in antiquity and today. There's shoreline subsidence, which means the shoreline of the first century is not the shoreline of today because of all of these earthquakes. Sudden land slippage into water, fluctuating lake levels, which can be dramatic. And so the idea of cities or villages being swallowed by a lake or drowned, it's geologically plausible in this area. So again, Josephus, the first textual anchor that we have that there is maybe some interesting stuff under the waters of the western shore of the Sea of Galilee is again our buddy Flavius Josephus. In Antiquities and Jewish War, Josephus records multiple catastrophic earthquakes in Galilee, towns destroyed in an instant, and ground rupturing and collapsing. The rabbinic literature talks about this as well. In fact, the rabbinic literature actually talks about a sunken city. So the folklore really crystallizes in rabbinic texts, 2nd to 6th centuries. The Talmud and the Midrash speak of cities punished and destroyed, places being swallowed, structures now lying underwater, and ruins that are occasionally visible when waters recede. All right, so is there a sunken city near Tiberias? Later Jewish and Arab folklore, and so this is late antique to medieval times, locates a submerged settlement near the western or northern shore, sometimes opposite Tiberias, sometimes visible as shapes or stones beneath clear water. Modern archaeology complicates but partially confirms this as well. Modern underwater surveys have found submerged structures, stone alignments, harbors and jetties now underwater, most famously the Sea of Galilee stone circle, which is massive, ancient, and mysterious. We're going to talk a little bit about this stone circle. Remember, Galilee, we're going to get into that again. All right, linguistic relatives of the word Galilee. The Hebrew root GLL carries the idea of to roll, to circle, to enclose. And that's why we're told that Galilee was originally called this because the region of land was circular. But if you see the same etymological root in Gilgal, which means rolling place, or specifically stone circle, Gilgal means stone circle, and Galal means to roll away as a rolling stone. So again, we are told that the name Galilee is due to the circular nature of the land or the region, but it doesn't always play out that way on the maps. But could it be that the ancients named this region after the stone circle, which was a sunken artifact that they could visibly and clearly see under the water in the first century? The Sea of Tiberias, it was clear water. You could see to the bottom, and they could actually see at that time this actual structure that they believed, and that's why rabbinic literature, Arabic literature, Flavius Josephus, and all these people documented a sunken city in the Sea of Tiberias because they saw the ruins at that point in time. So in summary, the folklore of a sunken city in the Sea of Galilee comes from real seismic destruction, shoreline collapse, visible underwater ruins, Josephus's catastrophe accounts, rabbinic moral memory, and later amplification into legend. So this is just a picture underwater. You're kind of missing. I've got details on the next slide because that little arrow up at the top is showing you how large this thing is. So this is a picture of the stone circle found underneath the waters in the Sea of Tiberias. All right, so this is the definition. A large cone-shaped stone structure approximately 7 meters or 230 feet in diameter and 10 meters or 32 feet tall. So it's large, and it lies submerged beneath the Sea of Galilee in Israel. So it was discovered via sonar in 2003. But again, when you've got a couple thousand years of seismic activity and being on a fault line and the shorelines shifting, obviously a lot of silt and things have covered this kind of, like when you see the Titanic and the destruction of the Titanic having been underwater. Obviously what it looks like today isn't what it looked like 100 years ago, right? So I think it's more accurate to say that it was rediscovered via sonar in 2003, but I absolutely believe that the people in the first century could see it visibly with their eyes, because we have people in history that reported and documented that they did see it. All right, it's a circular canonical stone structure. Some believe it's an ancient cairn, 230 feet in diameter, estimated weight 60,000 tons. Built of unworked basalt stones, likely dates to the early Bronze Age, almost certainly constructed on dry land, but later submerged by rising waters or tectonic shift. So again, it was likely at one time in the Bronze Age visible because it was on dry land. And then by the first century, it was visible in the clear waters of the Sea of Tiberias. All right. In Jewish thought, we're going to talk about what waters, and especially storm waters, and what that meant. When we talk about chaos, there's a lot of linguistic parallelism in the Old and New Testament. Revelation and Genesis come to mind, where waters are equated to chaos. It's equated to a war between good and evil, and the tohu bohu of Genesis. Where God is pushing back the waters. It's like it's a double meaning. He's creating land, but he's also at war with these chaos dragons. And then we see it again in Revelation, where the beast rises from the sea, and that when Jesus conquers, it says the sea is no more. And that doesn't mean that there'll be no waters or beachfront property in eternity. It means that he will have conquered the chaos dragons. There will be no more chaos to his creation. And so here's some of the evidences we have of Jewish thought. In Genesis 1-2, we have the Tehom, the primordial chaos. This is the tohu bohu. We have the flood waters of judgment and uncreation in Genesis 6-9. That's Noah, obviously. Sea monsters are mentioned all over Scripture. The marine spirits, the Leviathans, Rahab, the Behemoth, chaos opposed to God. The sea is untamable, threatening, death adjacent. All right, tohu bohu, guys, this is great. I know a lot of us have studied the tohu bohu, and we know that it has a lot to do with perhaps the gap theory, that instead of it being that God created the heavens and the earth, that it actually has more of, in Hebrew, it is more saying that the earth became chaotic. It was destroyed, and it was refashioned, reformed, recreated. And this gives birth to all sorts of prehistory doctrines that I think if you're interested in, Dr. Tom Horn, Dr. Michael Heiser, Gary Wayne, all have really wonderful tomes on prehistory, the world before Genesis 1:1, if you're interested in that. But I recently heard Dr. Michael Lake on a Skywatch TV episode where he says that etymologically the tohu and the bohu link back specifically also to Leviathan and Behemoth. And obviously the bohu Behemoth, we phonetically, even in English, can see some relation between those two words. Tohu is a little bit more non-obvious, but keep your eyes peeled for an upcoming Skywatch TV episode with Dr. Michael Lake, and he goes into more detail about that, and it was pretty cool. All right, we already talked to about the last 2 points, so I'll move on. Okay, so now imagine you are in first century Israel. You're fishing in the clear waters of the Sea of Tiberias. You're seeing massive stone formations beneath the surface with your own 2 eyes. And you know all this history and the stories and the oral history of earthquakes and judgment and Noah's Ark and Sodom and Gomorrah and this tohu bohu, you know culturally and contextually that fire and water are agents of global destruction, and they are very specifically linked to chaos forces and judgment of evil, judgment of the Watchers, judgment of the Nephilim, judgment of mankind, judgment of idolaters, etc. So, little bit of summary here. Jesus' interaction with the Sea of Galilee. He appears after his resurrection to a region where divine appearances would be believed. You know, if he had appeared in Jerusalem first with all of those scholars and religious leaders who had spent 40 to 80 years of their life studying the prophets and the scrolls and the Torah, and they knew, just like people know today, how to twist and contort and misread and misinterpret the scriptures. He knew that there would be disbelief and pushback. So he didn't go to Jerusalem after the resurrection. He didn't go to the place where all the Jews had rejected him. He went to Galilee, this region where people readily believed and didn't question divine reappearances. So it was just one less hoop he had to jump through to have to, you know, scientifically and theologically explain why he was back from the dead. Sea of Tiberias is where he walked on the water. This shows that he was reimagining the concept of the shades and the apparitions. And he calmed the storm. He controlled the weather. You know, Baal is the storm god, allegedly. And Jesus was calming that storm. And the unwritten message in that story was, I am the God of the storm. I control the weather. Go back to the book of Job. You know, where were you with all the hail and the snow and the storm clouds? And so even in these things, Jesus is very subtly, for those who are watching, claiming his deity. I am the one that controls the weather. I control the waves. I have no fear of these Leviathan, Behemoth, chaos, water spirits. I can walk on the water even when it's storming, even when it's dark. He's showing his power over the chaos. Okay, I'm skipping through some of these since it's review. So let's just do a quick little side-by-side here. Let's compare, just for giggles, I'm just doing this for fun. Let's just compare the biblical narrative of a sunken city beneath the Sea of Tiberias with all of the folklore and mythology of Atlantis, which if you dive into Atlantis and you learn all about the Tawawi stones and all that, you know that Atlantis was destroyed because they became too, now I don't know if I want to even get into all this right now, but basically they crumbled as a society. They had power, and they used the power for their own purposes, rather than using it for the recognition of the God that created them and their city. They used it to ascend and to become higher vibrational gods themselves. So with Atlantis, its defining traits are technological greatness, hubris, sudden destruction, swallowed by water, irreversible loss. So disappearance, it went away forever. So if you look at Atlantis as the Babylon or the Egypt or, you know, the beast system or Satan's world, or however you want to define that, in the Atlantis scenario, water wins, marine spirits threaten and harass, civilization is erased, memory replaces presence, and moral power without virtue collapses, and people and creation are disposable. But with Galilee, and I suppose one could argue Noah as well, water is still dangerous, but it is bounded. Storms still rage, but they can stop. Life continues after the catastrophe. There is always a remnant. It's not total destruction. And the moral is creation obeys God, not chaos. And so in this scenario, people in creation are valuable. They're redeemable. They're not disposable. So why was the gospel preached specifically in Galilee? Why was that Jesus's first locale? Well, in Galilee, storms make death plausible. Water makes loss imaginable. Ruins make judgment visible. All these places, storms, water, ruins, these things that turned into folklore about death and ghosts and divine retribution and fear and drowning. Jesus redeemed that and was making it possible for man to reimagine the folklore that, contrary to what you have been taught, there is a way to conquer and have victory over these aspects of death. So Jesus, he walks on the water, he stills the storm, he's reimagining, he's adding extra facets to their folklores about divine reappearances and apparitions. So he's not opposing the myth, he's not getting rid of the myths, but he's overriding it. He is putting a new polish on it. So where Atlantis ends in silence, Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I." All right. Wrong one, guys. All right, so that is the end of my PowerPoint. And again, I forgot to mention at the beginning that if anybody wanted questions or they wanted something put up on the board, to put it in all caps. And I think I've still got Katie with me for another 5 minutes. So Katie, if there's anything you want to put up there, I'm going to check and see if you saved anything in the comments too. All right. Okay. Okay, thanks, Katie. Interesting that Baal was the storm god. Reminds me of current weather manipulation by evil entities. Yes, yes, yes. So thanks for that, Tiny Loves. Here's another discussion we can do at a later time, because this is amazing too. Katie, can you put that comment back up for 1 second so I can recapture my thought? Okay. Yeah. Okay, if you want to talk about weather manipulation and the HARP stuff and the geoengineering, all that kind of stuff, that goes back. Like, we think like, oh, that's new technology. This goes all the way back. It actually ties directly in to Vlad the Impaler and Wallachia and the old vampire legends. It has to do with the Sholomants. And I had an amazing video where I had interviewed Dr. Judd Burton, where we talked about all this, and the tech issues were so bad that there was like nothing usable in the recording. And so what I'll probably do on a future live stream, either by myself, I'd love to get Dr. Judd and Sharon Gilbert on, because they're well researched in this, but the Sholomants was a Solomonic occult mystery school, and only certain bloodlines were initiated into this order. And the Sholomants, if you were the valedictorian of the class, which Vlad the Impaler was in his day and age, if you were the top student, you were, in addition to all of your honors, you were given the title Der Wettermacher, which is German for the weather maker. And interestingly, for those of you who are into the Nosferatu lore, Nosferatu, in both the 1922 and the 2025 versions, whether it's through a prop or whether it's through a character actually saying it, it is very directly, Nosferatu is we're told that he was in the order of the Sholomants. And we see it proven that he was probably Der Wettermacher, because when he was on the Impusa, the ship that was going to bring him to Visburg, he you don't catch it so much in the 2025 because he's speaking in Enochian, and I don't know that they're translating everything on the screen, but he's basically doing a mock of Jesus, and he's controlling the weather and the wind and the waves, and he's speeding the ship faster so that he can get to Ellen Hutter more quickly. And so that, in line with the direct telling that he was part of the Sholomants, it's indicating that he was their Wettermacher. And that's another direct link between Nosferatu and Vlad of Wallachia. And Vlad's an interesting character. We only hear about the vampire stuff, but believe it or not, Vlad was actually sort of like the George Washington of his time. He was a revolutionary. He was doing a lot of things for Wallachia and fighting the power. Super, super interesting history. So, Katie, I don't know if you're still on. I know it's about a minute here before you need to go, but if you've got anything else you want to throw up there. All right. There we go. A question. There are legends about monsters and ghosts connected to biblical events in Galilee. So yeah, so there are, what I did today was sort of like just kind of icing on the cake. And I gave you hints as to where you can look to find more of the lore. Flavius Josephus, Second Temple Judaism, the rabbis talk about it. If you Google in the right places, like Internet Archive is a great place. Sacred Texts is another place. Gutenberg is another good place. You can get good ancient free resources on those sites. But yeah, there are all sorts of ancient folklore tying ghosts, apparitions, and high strangeness to Galilee for the very reasons that we're talking about today. That it was built over these tombs, and there was a sunken city, which means before that sea was there was likely another city that we don't know about from the Bible that was destroyed in an instant due to judgment. All right. Cindy from South Africa. Hey, Cindy, thanks for joining. First time here. Thank you. Came in late, but wow, thorough and very interesting. Thank you. We'll be watching more of your content. Cindy, thank you so much. I always love to hear it from other people around the world, brothers and sisters in Christ around the world. Love it. All right. Question once again from Tiny Loves. Question on the topic of astral projection and traveling up to the high places. Are you saying that Jacob did that? Okay. I'm really glad you brought that up. I talk about this a lot in my next book, From Eden to AI, which is coming out in June. So yeah, here's the deal, guys. Jacob was not a born again Christian. Okay. And in fact, there's indications that before he had this divine encounter with Yahweh at Luz, he likely wasn't like following, the religion of his dad and grandpa, because just look from the text. He was a deceiver. He was a supplanter, and he was deceiving his father, and he was taking birthrights. And so it is my estimation, based upon my research on the city of Luz, which then became Bethel, which is house of God, after Jacob had his experience. Here's some interesting stuff about Luz. The ancient city of Luz was, it was a very esoteric place where people would go to have divine revelations. It's where they would go to astral project. And what they would do is there were these large Jupiter stones. It was Jupiter lapis. And they would lay their heads on the stones. And because of the particular frequency and what it would do to their pineal gland and the energies coming off of their brains, is it would cause them to instantly astral project. And so when Jacob went to Luz, he thought he was going to die. He thought Esau was going to come and kill him and his wives and his children. And he was terrified. He was in a desperate situation. And because I don't think that he at that point was really seriously following the God of his father and grandfather, I think in desperation, he went to Luz and put his head down on a Jupiter stone. It says in the text that he laid his head down on a stone as a pillow. And he did have a celestial conversation, but it wasn't likely the one that he expected. And I go into explicit detail in my book about this, because even the stairway or the ladder, if you look at a ziggurat, a four-sided ziggurat, if you're only seeing that in 1D, it could look like a stairway or a ladder. And so what he was likely seeing there was a ziggurat. And what's actually really offensive. If you're really reading what's going on there, he was having an astral experience, and God of all places showed up. The God of Abraham and Isaac showed up in that place, which is mind-blowing if you really think about it. And that's why Jacob called it Bethel. He renamed it. No, this isn't Luz. This isn't the esoteric portal through the hazelnut tree, which was esoteric code for the pineal gland. And that's why he anointed that stone with oil and dedicated it as a monument to the living God, the God of his fathers. He was changing the who owned that place. And what's interesting is the people of Luz shortly after that packed up and left town. And I talk about this in the book too, because if you're reading closely in the Old Testament, there's 2 cities of Luz. And that's because they abandoned the first city and they went and they created a second city. And one of the reasons I think they abandoned the first Luz is because Yahweh appeared there and likely had an effect on their business. And it's a huge rabbit hole to dive down. And like I said, stay tuned in June. I have a massive section on that in my upcoming book, From Eden to AI. So, all right. I don't know if Katie is still on. She is. Okay. Question. So to confirm, astral projection is not of Yahweh. This is a hot topic at the moment, by the way. Yeah. Yep. So there is a huge difference between astral projection and let's back up here. Okay. So we have in scripture examples where people saw the throne room of God. John on the island of Patmos in Revelation. Paul, who said, I once knew a man, and whether he was there for real or in spirit, I don't know, but I was in the third heaven. Okay, this is how we differentiate between a encounter where you're in the throne room of God and an astral projection scenario. The clues are in the Corinthians passage that I just talked about, where Paul talks about going to the third heaven, and contrasting that with Ephesians 6:12. So in Ephesians 6:12, it talks about the high places or the heavenly places, depending on your translation. And the Greek word there is epuranios. And if you go into the Thayer's and the Briggs Driver commentaries, and you go into the ancient literature, the actual meaning there of epuranios is the second heaven. It's not our sky with the clouds in it. It's not the throne room of God. And obviously we know it's not the throne room of God because it already says at the beginning of the verse, your battle's not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, archons, which are fallen, rebellious angels, spiritual forces of wickedness. And so it's plainly telling us in Ephesians 6:12 that the high places, the epuranios, the second heaven, the astral plane, is inhabited by beings and entities that are enemies of mankind and enemies of God. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't appear as angels of light and love, and you can't go there and feel good, or that it doesn't mean that everybody up there is a shadow creature or a demon or they're out to get you. Like, in fact, the deeper and deeper entrenched you get in, the more those things are going to be appearing as angels and as adepts and ascended masters and gurus and spirit guides and things like that. And it would behoove them to appear in beautiful form and as your friends, because they're trying to communicate arcane knowledge to you, which was the same knowledge that was being given to people in the days of Noah, when the Watchers came down and shared the mysteries of heaven with mankind, which led to the destruction of mankind. And so it's basically Genesis 6. Astral projection is Genesis 6 in reverse. The heavenly beings know that they cannot leave their first estate and come down to earth and interact with mankind without consequence. So now they lure people into their home turf, because now it's us. Now it's mankind that's leaving their first estate and going elsewhere. And so, If you compare the epiranios of Ephesians 6:12 with the third heaven that Paul mentions in Corinthians, it's a different word. It's a different Greek word, and it means the throne room of God. And so the difference between astral projection and being pulled into the throne room is that when you look at, like, let's say Ezekiel, John, Moses, or no, Abraham rather, and Paul, sorry, they didn't know this was going to happen. They just went to bed that night, and they weren't looking for this. They weren't, breathing or, dropping shrooms or saying like, I gotta figure this out and I need to talk to God. They were brought to that place without any sort of a warning. They were terrified when they were there, and they didn't just. There wasn't like a little like revolving door where anytime a Christian wants to get into the throne room of God, we just go up there, and that's just not the way it works. Whereas with astral projection, it is a man induced experience, not a God induced experience. And so there's a lot of differences and caveats. And we also know that from Galatians 1:1, even if an angel from heaven says something to you different than what we've preached, let him fall under a curse. So that's the way we test the spirits. Is everything falling in line with truth? Another thing that I like to warn people about is that we cannot use our emotions or our feelings as the sole litmus test for where we were at, because a lot of people that astral project talk about it being wonderful and full of love and light, and all their questions were answered and it changed their life and they were transformed. And most of the experiences where people in the Bible came into contact with the throne room or with an angel, their response was fear. They were aware of their sin. They recognized they were in the presence of holiness, and it put a spotlight on their own hearts. A lot of them were fainting. A lot of them had terror. A lot of them, like Daniel, were sick, physically ill for weeks because they couldn't mesh what had happened. So we can't use our feelings as a guide. All right. I'm kind of assuming, I keep thinking Katie's going to drop off because I know she usually only has about 10 minutes after the hour. So, all right. Thanks everyone for joining. I guess I'm going to leave it at that for now. Thanks to everyone who watched and who was in the chat and all the comments and the conversation and the questions. And thanks again, everybody who has joined in, who's subscribed, who's shared stuff. I appreciate it so much. And I will be back on here again next Tuesday at 1 p.m. Central. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful week.